Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
Good morning, Team Krulak community, and on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare, welcome back to the Broadcast, our series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. I'm your host, Major Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, any other agency of the U.S. government, or any other entities with our guests may be affiliated. So today, Team Krulak is proud to present one of the crown jewels of both our Krulak Scholars program and our non-resident fellow outreach. Today we have Capt Casey LaMar, United States Marine Corps, and Dr. Leah Windsor, who both first started collaborating on this research that they're going to present today, while Captain LaMar was attending Expeditionary Warfare School in academic year 2021. That project went from a research paper to a presentation that has been highlighted at academic conferences, most recently at the 2022 U.S. Strategic Command Deterrence and Academic Alliance Conference. So we're very excited to learn more about their work in this broadcast. So I'll go through our guests now, and then we'll get to the presentation. Dr. Leah Windsor is an associate professor in the Department of English, Applied Linguistics, and the Institute for Intelligent Systems at the University of Memphis, where she directs the Languages Across Cultures Lab. She is PI on an NSF grant studying multimodal communication. Her book with Dr. Carrie F. Crawford, The PhD Parenthood Trap, is available at Georgetown University Press. She serves on the editorial board of International Studies Quarterly and International Studies Perspectives. And as I said, she's also one of our non-resident fellows here at the Krulak Center. Capt Casey LaMar is an intelligence officer currently serving with the 13th Marine Expeditionary Unit. He graduated from George Washington University, where he studied international affairs and Arabic. He was previously published in the Journal of International Negotiation and Small Wars Journal. When not writing and spending time with his wife, daughter, and 2 Australian Shepherds in Southern California. So to Dr. Windsor and Captain LaMar, welcome to both of you. Very excited to have you here and learn more about your work together. And I'll go ahead and be quiet and start pulling up your slides and let you get going.
Thank you, Major Brown.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone else who's joined us here today, and thank you to anyone who as well will be watching this recording into the future. Dr. Windsor and I actually first got linked up through Major Brown in the non-resident fellows program at the Krulak Center. I was not a Krulak fellow at the time. I was actually studying the Beyond Boyd seminar at the time, and had a lot of questions and a lot of interesting research ideas associated with better understanding kind of the work of John Boyd. And what that led to was a conversation about language and a conversation about how we can better understand with new technology and with new tools what human interactions are becoming in the information age, and how we can better understand those human interactions. So I got linked up with Dr. Windsor, and we just started having conversations about research ideas. And I got to better appreciate her research and where her field of study is, and also where the literature for her field of study currently is, and where the gaps are. And what we started to realize is that there was a huge gap, both from our side operationally, and then on the academic side in the research realm, around this conversation of measures of effectiveness in the information space and how that translates to policy. And being able to predict policy changes based on these changes in language that we were seeing in the metadata. So as a result of that, it started as a basic question of where does the U.S. really care about these potential shifts? And it's honestly our security partners, whether it's the Philippines, it's Korea, Japan, or in any of our NATO partners, or in CENTCOM as well. These critical security partners were where we started having the conversation about the key metric being basing and access, and as the measure that we are focused against. And if that can change, what can we know, and how early can we know it in order to predict any shifts in what we should promote if it's going to go positive, or potentially prevent if it's going to go negative. And that's what started this project. We looked at all our options, and what we really focused on through the refinements of our conferences that we've gone to is what you're going to see today, which is a conversation about both what we are saying and how we are saying it in the metadata, and how that translates into what we are calling legitimacy, which is a David Lake term that is commonly used in the political science realm to measure hierarchy, but we are applying within the information realm as a measure of effectiveness, and talking about how that is measured as a leading indicator of policy shifts for countries. So why do we care? That's always the first question that I think I always have to answer whenever I bring up a presentation. And for me, at least, and for our community of interest in the Marine Corps in particular, basing and access always became a persistent conversation in our future and our security, and the potential for any future campaigning, if you will, within any theater is entirely based on, well, which countries will actually allow U.S. forces to set up bases, allow overflight, allow non-permanent access, or facilitate exercises. And we whittled it down to these 5 countries, which in the last 6 years now have had significant shifts qualitatively in their cooperation with the United States. Whether it's the Philippines threatening to eliminate the VFA starting in 2016, which has shifted now, obviously, but from 2016 to about 2021, there were significant questions about whether or not the Philippines would continue to cooperate with the United States. Japan, on the other side of the coin, and back in 2021, actually agreed to increase the amount of the percentage of cost that it would take for actually facilitating more U.S. troops on its soil. Conversely, Jordan actually has reduced the friction, if you will, on U.S. forces coming in and out of their country. Turkey, on the other hand, since 2017, which we are familiar with, has persistently defied certain U.S. policy goals associated with the F-35 program and purchasing other weapon systems from the Russians and things of that nature, are leading eventually into 2019, threatening to close military bases in Turkey. And finally, Poland, which we all remember the famous headlines back in, I believe, 2020. The conversation was if Poland would actually facilitate a new U.S. military base on Polish soil. And so that's where we focused a lot of this research. So for those who are not familiar with kind of the literature that inspired this, I got introduced to Nexon and Cooley through the Krulak Fellow Program. And the conversation that we had with them was informative to me in the sense of defining what section in the long line of U.S. history we may be in at this point, which is the reordering of the international order. And if we are truly in this reordering of the international order, the conversation becomes, this is a discrete period that we can focus on. And this is where our research needs to focus for understanding any language shifts and understanding where countries are reordering and why they are reordering the direction that they are. With that in mind, we turn to the literature from Dr. David Lake out of UCSD, who has been talking extensively for years, since I believe 2008, 2009, about this concept of legitimacy and how leading countries need to demonstrate that they are responsible leaders, and that subordinates conversely demonstrate that they are committed members of the group. And so we locked onto this term that he uses in his book, Hierarchy in the International Relations, about acts of obeisance, which acts of obeisance, as David Lake likes to discuss it, are around cost-imposing choices that are a constant demonstration from the subordinate to the superior that they will remain members and committed members of the group. And so from that perspective, we were thinking about quantifying that, excuse me, quantifying that by cost. So anything from actually following the United States into the invasion in Iraq in 2003 into 2004 as a high cost, obviously, choice, all the way down to what about language? Does language have a role along this line of acts of obeisance, or a routine commitment to the international hierarchy and to whatever the United States has as policy priorities? And if shifts in those acts of obeisance in the low-cost realm, especially around language in international forums like the United Nations, can that be a leading indicator of future choices to not follow the United States into, say, a major international war? So we focused on the UN General Assembly corpus, which is corpus as in a body of language, is what that refers to. And Dr. Windsor actually turned me on to the UN General Assembly corpus is probably our best candidate for what we're talking about. One, because there's a significant amount of research already existing on this corpus that validates both the metrics that we are using and their association with much of the policy shifts that we are looking at. There's several papers out there looking at how certain language patterns in the General Assembly distinguish between a democratic country, a totalitarian country, and policy priorities associated with things like human rights. So we thought this is probably a good candidate for what we were looking at. So within this, we broke it out into pattern similarity, and then the following slide will be language similarity or semantic similarity. Now, to focus on this for a moment, just for everyone to get a better understanding of what we're talking about here, syntax simplicity, narrativity, shallow cohesion, word concreteness, and deep cohesion were the 5 metrics that we were using and normalizing across them to create what is called a Mahalanobis distance. What is important to know about this is that it's a non-scaled, similar to a Euclidean distance, except for it's non-scaled, and it allows you to compare shifts in pattern across multiple vectors, which helps you determine the distance between two different sets of data. So in this case, we focused on US as the baseline and comparing the distance between the US and whatever country we're attempting to measure. And this helps us understand how far, by standards of deviation, a country is shifting away from the United States in their pattern. Now, moving on to what they're saying, this has a different measure. We use cosine similarity. And this is the measure between 1 being absolute similarity and 0 being absolute difference. Now, within the vectors that are created out of this algorithm called dot2vec, we're able to measure what each document that is assessed within the corpus is actually emphasizing semantically. And what that allows you to measure is that each document over time gives you a vector or an associate of between the United States and this country. How much do certain topics come up? How much are they emphasizing certain things that they care about within their language? And that allows you to measure how often things like, say, human rights is coming up as a conversation point between the United States and this other country, and whether or not that's a true measure of how close they are, quote, following the leader in what their semantics are demonstrating. So that kind of leads us to our 3 hypotheses. Now, we use the word language mirroring to represent both semantic and pattern. Now, as we go forward, we're actually going to break these out, but for the sake of the hypotheses, we actually combined them for the sake of simplicity. And the language mirroring we assessed would be correlated directly to shifts in cooperation. So language mirroring we anticipated would increase prior to any threshold event that would increase cooperation, and conversely for decrease prior to a decrease in cooperation. And then we anticipated that language will also be used as an affirming tool post the shift to demonstrate that we are even more committed now or even less committed. And graphically, if you can go to the next slide, please, to help you visualize this. This is essentially our causal chain and how we anticipate it being broken out. So as you can see, language mirroring goes up, so does our focus metric, which is basing and access. And then language mirroring would continue after and converse for the inverse. So on to our cases. So why did we get locked on certain years, and why did we get locked on certain countries? So for the Philippines and Japan, as US Indo-PACOM critical allies and partners, we looked at the Philippines as probably the most out of those critical partners, uncooperative in the last 6 years, consistently threatening the United States that they would revoke the Visiting Forces Agreement. With 2016 as our focus year, since that's the year that President Duterte was elected. and started his campaign and discussions about actually eliminating the U.S. cooperation agreements and even fielding ideas of cooperating with China and having joint exercises with China and Russia. We also used Japan as a contrary case to that, or a positive case, in which Japan has over the last few years actually agreed to increase its share of cost sharing in U.S. basing in its own country. For CENTCOM, unfortunately, we couldn't find a negative case that didn't have too many other factors that would have made the data hard to read, honestly, and hard to attribute to any language shifts due to political instability and the continuous reordering of that region, unfortunately. But one stable country with a stable regime throughout the entire period was Jordan. And so Jordan, as a positive case, helped us focus on what shifts in actually CENTCOM can look like. And then finally, for Poland and Turkey, and correction, I said 2020 earlier, we actually looked at 2018. Poland actually in 2018 was advertising the potential for actually paying for a new U.S. military base on its own soil. And conversely, Turkey in 2017 started purchasing S-400s and then eventually translated in 2019 a threat to actually close the military bases in Turkey. Now, an important thing to consider with Turkey is a lot of its policy shifts are often blamed on the shakeout of the 2016 coup. And so we did take that into consideration during our assessment of the data set. But the other 4 cases had a stable regime with limited political instability, and the language changes were much more able to attribute to actual shifts in policy preferences of that regime. So going into the model cases. So first talking about the Philippines. So this is a Mahalanobis distance measurement, and this is the pattern similarity that we talked about earlier, which is the five actual metrics that we are combining into a common measurement of this country versus the United States. Now, more positive in the Mahalanobis means less similar, which will be confusing because it's actually inverse for the cosine. So please keep that in mind when looking at these graphs. The dots you were looking at are actually U.S. military permanently based on the data set we were receiving from our friends Alan and McCain and the crew that have been studying U.S. presences in countries and what that translates into local interpretations of U.S. government and U.S. policies. So from their data set, measuring changes in U.S. troop deployments or troop permanent presence in these countries, we all are very familiar with the change in the 90s of the closing of U.S. military bases in the Philippines. And yet, after that, we see a distinct shift in the Philippines pattern, starting in the late 90s and continuing all the way through 2016, continuing after 2016 to the end of our data set in about 2020. We see a continuous shift away from the United States by 2 full standards of deviation. So from that perspective, we were able to interpret that while certainly nowhere along this path could you probably sit there and say that's the moment where the United States should have known something was going to happen, we do think that ignoring this metric removes a lot of context from understanding how much the Philippines relationship had been deteriorating with the United States since the late 90s. And so keeping that in mind, we did shift and compare that to another country, Japan. And almost to mimic, but in the inverse, the Japan shift goes to actually almost 3 standards of deviation towards similarity along the same time period. And we also see that the U.S. actually increased its permanent troop presence in Japan over that same time frame, especially into the 2010s all the way to now, as Japan becomes one of the key security partners in the new global competition. Now, what is interesting, we took these same 2 countries and we looked at semantic similarity. Now, to gauge your expectations, a 1 is never observed in the data set, and neither is 0. In the United Nations, everyone is at least talking about the same thing some of the times. What we saw is that low numbers are typically around 0.2 to 0.3, and very high numbers are in the 0.7 range. Now, to give you that kind of gauge of high and low metrics, what's still interesting about this is that the Philippines is relatively stable in its semantic similarity. What it is talking about, and not how it is talking, is relatively stable and relatively sitting in the average between our high and our low. So if you were focusing on what is the Philippines talking about, you might miss the fact that they are actually drifting away from us. And the same is true for Japan. Japan, again, relatively relatively stable. And also, within the last 10 years, drifting slowly away from the United States towards the lower end of the spectrum. So we found that these actually do not correlate to these policy shifts that we were focused on. The only case that actually followed our model to the T was Jordan. So looking at the data, we see that Jordan's pattern actually starts shifting in the 1980s, while their semantic similarity doesn't shift until the 90s. And by the time we're hitting the 2020s, they're actually sitting in the top third, if you will, of semantic similarity. And they've drifted almost a full standard deviation away towards the United States in terms of language pattern similarity. What we found really interesting is that the pattern similarity was actually the leading indicator of the semantic similarity by almost 10 years. Actually, sorry, over 10 years. So with that in mind, we started looking at pattern similarity as probably the leading indicator. And we really drilled down on pattern similarity as an important metric that we wanted to further look at whether or not it's reflecting in other people's research. And from that perspective, we landed on the Allen et al. Famous surveys from 2014 that translated into the 2020 paper. And in their paper, they were talking about doing the surveys they did, which was around interviewing citizens of these countries that are listed below who had consistent interactions with U.S. troops deployed to their country in some kind of permanent capacity. And the question that they asked was, can we see a difference between those who directly interact or benefit economically from American troops and how they interpret U.S. government policies and those who do not? And what they found was distinctly that those who do have consistent interaction with American troops have a relatively favorable interpretation of U.S. government policies and U.S. Foreign policy priorities. From that perspective, they came to the conclusion that U.S. troops have a positive influence on relationships with a country. And so we wanted to ask, does that translate into pattern similarity? Would you see a consistent U.S. deployment to a country translating into a shift in that pattern? And what we found out was that it's a weak correlation at best. We did not find consistent support for that case. And most interestingly, if you look at the Philippines case, which is in the right column, both those who do interact with the United States and troops deployed to the country and those who do not have a favorable interpretation of U.S. government and U.S. foreign policy. And it is a consistent conversation point that the people of the Philippines love the United States. It is a consistent question that comes up every time we talk about the shift of the Philippines away from the United States and the risk of losing them in our sphere of influence. And yet those two favorables do not translate to a similarity trend in pattern. And so we came to the conclusion that this trickle-up theory, while it may be true, we're not saying it's falsified by our research. We need to have skepticism about it. We really do. So to summarize some of our points, we found that pattern similarity does have a strong correlation to policy shifts, with even 10 plus years lead time on some of these shifts. Within 4 of our 5 cases, those policy trends were well over 10 years in advance. The exception was Turkey. Turkey, we saw that policy shift actually reflect post 2016, and in 2017, 2018, and into 2019, a pattern towards dissimilarity continued. For semantic similarity, it's actually relatively stable for several of the countries that we analyzed, even though there were significant shifts in the pattern of their cooperation. Jordan was the only case that followed our expectations. And then our comparison to Allen et al. Is that we didn't find support in our research to reinforce this trickle-up theory that is talked about within the literature, where U.S. troops deployed to a country translate into positive goodwill for citizens who benefit from their presence, that then translates into the policy goals of that country. And we unfortunately didn't find any support for that theory within our research, and we recommend that those who do approach the trickle-up theory do so with some skepticism from our contrary cases. So finally, our synthesis, we're saying that the pattern trends actually supported all 3 hypotheses. While the semantic trends they partially supported hypothesis 1, which was similarity leading to increased cooperation, but more so we saw more of a reflection. As major shifts happened with cooperation or lack of cooperation, that shift in cooperation was reflected in semantically, much more consistently. But even then, the shifts were not significant, not as significant as we saw within the pattern similarity. And then finally, the trickle up conversation, I'm certainly interested in having more conversations about that. It's a consistent conversation operationally when we deploy troops to countries, when we do exercises with the foreign militaries. A lot of what underpins that is this theory that we are generating goodwill that will translate to foreign policy priorities of this country. And we did not find that support in our research. So from our conclusions, we find that linguistic similarity is generally a leading indicator of changes in U.S. basing and access to a country. In particular, we're focused on saying that it's not what we are saying, but how we are saying it that is the true leading indicator that we need to be focusing on. And from that perspective, we also think that legitimacy needs to be looked at seriously as a metric of effectiveness for this new strategic competition that we were talking about. And within the context of what we were talking with Stratcom about was how can we measure strategic lines of effort for information operations and for U.S. policy priorities associated with influence. And this gives you one of those tools. What we also recommend, obviously, is with 5 case studies and with our initial research, which has taken about a year to get together, there obviously needs to be a lot more research on this topic. We think it's very fruitful. We need to talk about popular versus elite language, looking at what are locals saying versus what is being talked about at the United Nations, or what is that government saying to its own people versus what it's saying to the world. What are the economic indicators that may be influencing some of these language shifts that we didn't look at within our own research? Maybe also looking at comparing countries' shifts from the United States and then comparing that to shifts to or from China or to or from Russia as the 2 other major, if you will, leaders in the international order at this time. And then also talking about revisiting the effects of U.S. troop presence on popular opinion and whether or not popular language ever translates into elite language. And with that, ultimately, we came to the conclusion that Gandhi probably said it best, which is that our thoughts lead to our words, which lead to our actions, which lead to habits, values, and destiny, obviously. And within that, we do need to continually think about what we are saying and how we are saying it matters. because if we are not careful about anticipating what people are saying and why they're saying what they're saying, we're going to miss when they start changing what they are doing. So finally, we can turn over to questions.
All right, Capt LaMar, thank you very much for that. I mean, this is, I've read your paper before. I think the initial one you did for the Krulak Scholars, but this is really the first time I've sort of seen the more mature version of your collective research, and this is fascinating stuff. So I definitely appreciate you and Dr. Windsor taking time here. So I got a couple questions, and then I'll ask the audience if you have a question. Go ahead and throw it into the chat there, and I'll get to it. But first, Dr. Windsor, do you have any additional comments or thoughts you'd like to share before we go into Q&A?
No, I just want to reiterate how much it has been a joy to work with Capt LaMar on this project. And I couldn't have said it better myself. This is fantastic.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, like I said, so I got a couple of things to throw your way before I start asking the audience. So I was telling Capt LaMar before we started, I was hoping you both of you could take some time to talk about your experiences in the conferences that you presented these things at, kind of with an eye to, as an example that we can show to our current, and future possible crops of the Krulak Scholars, because this is a very unique output of those programs. We've had, from all our various programs, we've had, presentations to general grade officers, or we've had publications, lots of articles published in places like the Marine Corps Gazette and otherwise. But to my knowledge, this is a unique thing. So one, if you could both sort of talk about your experiences, what got you what the invite to those conferences, what they were sort of looking for from you. And then second, I am particularly on the Strategic Command Conference. What were, that's one that's sort of a more military focused audience, I believe, but also, they deal with some of our most strategic level, weapons and deployment and considerations. What was it they were looking for from you and from your research at that particular conference in terms of, whether they were looking to adjust policy or strategy, et cetera?
Sure. So Dr. Windsor actually was the one who really opened my eyes to the potential of conferences. And I can give tons of plugs to all the ISA conferences that she actually helps run and chair. And from her experience, I got turned on to ISA West as a good candidate for our very first, first run to see if this dog will hunt on where our research is and getting some honest feedback about it. I would say to anyone who is a Krulak fellow currently and who is looking to start, marketing their research, if you will, or at least shopping it around to see where it will gain traction. The conference is honestly one of the best venues for that. And the barrier to entry is honestly relatively low. A lot of the diversity that military perspectives bring to these conferences is incredibly valuable from what I've been told. And from that perspective, a lot of what we were talking about helped inform other people's research and generated a lot of interesting conversations. So it's not just about what my paper is going to, what feedback my paper is going to get, but a lot of the collaboration opportunities that you're going to get out of that conference. So I would say to anyone who is thinking about it is talk to the non-resident fellows about where they feel this particular paper will gain its best traction, or where your research has the best opportunity to get some positive feedback and find collaboration opportunities for future research. I don't know, Dr. Windsor, if you have any other enhancing comments on that before we go to the Strategic Command one.
So, the Krulak Center Fellows Program really allowed Capt LaMar and me to have very long conversations over a long period of time where we explored different ideas. This project didn't start out looking like what what Capt LaMar presented today. It was very much an evolution. Academia and different disciplines of academia have particular jargon. the military and its various branches have particular jargon. And so part of it is just aligning, and I don't say jargon pejoratively, I mean, like there's just a vernacular that that people use, which also helps to demonstrate in group, like, you know, what group membership you have. And so part of it is just figuring out, oh, we're talking about the same thing, we're just calling it different things. And so it was just the process of arriving at this paper was really rewarding. And, you know, in terms of conferences, Capt LaMar's right there. It's a pretty low barrier to entry. You know, you submit an abstract. So there was just the big International Studies Association conference last week, which happens annually. And then there are regional conferences. I've been most affiliated with the ISA Midwest, which happens in St. Louis every November. But we presented at ISA West. There's also an ISA South and ISA Northeast. And so depending on where you're located geographically, these regional conferences are just really nice audiences to present your research at whatever stage you're at. If it's just a brand new idea, if it's fully developed and you know, you want to do the sanity test of does this make sense? It's just a great place to get feedback on your work and get your ideas out there as well. So the International Studies Association and the American Political Science Association are both good places to do this.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say on my experience with ISA West before going to StratCom was our conference chair was another non-resident fellow of the Krulak Center,
Yes.
Patrick James. And so his feedback to us was incredibly valuable. And we were able to engage him just on a personal level as well, in that we were trying to fit a lot into a very small paper on the very first go through this. I would say we were probably trying to fit 5 or 6 papers into one paper at one point, where we just had so many research ideas. We had so many thoughts about what this gives potential for. And Dr. James helped us during the conference to refine what we're talking about and if you're going to say your very first paper on this topic, where can we focus all of that effort on one specific thing? And so that's where we whittled it down to this period of time with these specific countries, talking about these specific metrics with this associated change in policy. So that helped us a lot, and I thought it was extremely valuable, especially as Dr. Windsor's talking about the policy side of where I'm sitting on the operational forces and where she's sitting in the academia, and talking about figuring out where those two meet in the middle somewhere and how that creates the beautiful Venn diagram of common interest. It took some time, took a lot of exploratory learning. And it helped a lot to have an outside perspective who was a friend of the fellowship program to help us out. Mm-hmm. Now, going into the U.S. StratCom Academic Alliance, so that's put on by U Nebraska, and the topic that we fell under was a conversation around information operations at the strategic level, and what does that mean? The conference and the section that I fell under focused a lot on a conversation around what's being termed sharp power. And for those who are not familiar with the sharp power term, between soft power and hard power, the idea of hard power being military force, kinetic effects, and the idea of soft power being influence and culture and media and goodwill programs through non-government organizations and donations. The sharp power piece sitting in the middle is somewhere around what we are currently experiencing in Ukraine, which is the U.S. imposing sanctions on a country and imposing cost on countries associated with economics and in the information space, and making it very difficult for Russia to interact internationally as a consequence of their current invasion. So from that perspective, a lot of the discussion around sharp power started turning into a conversation around how can we strategically understand flashpoints? How can we strategically understand where reordering will occur? And how can we strategically understand what we are doing as a whole of government will actually influence those changes to either prevent conflict, with the idea that strategic deterrence doesn't work if we have a flashpoint, And conversely, where can we actually anticipate these flashpoints occurring with significant reordering, such as if a critical U.S. security partner decides to start cooperating with another country?
All right, great. Thank you very much. And Dr. Windsor, anything to add to that before I go to the audience questions?
Nope, that's great. Great
Okay.
summary.
Awesome, thank you. So, yeah, I got a few questions here in the chat here, so I'll stow what I have right now, and I want to get to our audience folks. So first, we had Carlos, who'd entered a couple of questions into the chat here, and since this is not my field at all, I don't want to try and mangle what he's asking you all by trying to interpret it myself. So, Carlos, if you want to go ahead, you can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question directly to our guests.
Well, thank you very much. Great presentation. First of all, amazing. And just make sure I get this. I don't speak for the World Bank or the Harvard or in any way, shape, or form. And, you know, I don't even speak for my dog. You know, my dog has his own little opinions and stuff. Just making sure. Okay. Specifically, I was wondering, what exactly was the hypothesis falsifying when you were doing these different broad averages of the metrics? We're talking kind of like the centrality of the distribution, or like how were you thinking about what's being falsified exactly when it comes to the quantifiable hypothesis? What is the null, and like how do you construct those two? Because you know, particularly when it comes to these kind of language metrics and spaces, it seems very hard to get baseline and then be able to measure and evaluate kind of thing. And then for the record, so do mostly measurement and evaluation. That's why I'm kind of like, yeah.
No, it was a fair conversation. And we talked about what is our null hypothesis at all. Within the paper, we do present our null hypothesis. We didn't present it here, but we use the global average as the baseline reference point. So if a country deviated outside what we would anticipate as the baseline, which was following global trend, that is where we assess that was actually a significant shift away from what you would call baseline. So, for example, the actual global meta trend, when we averaged every single country for pattern similarity and for cosine similarity, we saw that circa 2000, I believe it was in the mid 2000s into the 2010s, we saw a distinct shift away from the United States. At least a full standard deviation away. And we can pull up the graph, and I can email you directly the paper if you're interested in having a longer conversation about how we actually created this baseline. But what we saw in the two contradictory cases where we sat there and said, these countries are deviating well before this actual meta shift. And the same was true for those who shifted towards us. Were happening well before this meta shift and actually running contrary to the meta shift. And so what we were looking at is, okay, where are these countries sitting outside of our baseline, and when are they actually sitting within our baseline? So that's why we looked at Japan was very interesting, and a lot of other countries within that context were very interesting, because Japan actually was following the meta trend semantically as we were going into the late 2010s. And so that's why we viewed that the semantics actually didn't support our correlations, because a lot of the time it would either remain relatively stable or it would follow the meta trend consistently. Whatever the world is talking about, that country in particular is also talking about.
On that note, and maybe this is kind of missing something very obvious here. My understanding is you oversample some countries because they talk more and undersample others. How were you thinking about that when you were creating the meta trend? This large.
So there's the country contributions come from the United Nations General Assembly General Debate, and we used only the speeches that were given in English, and I'll elaborate on this point in a little bit in just a moment. But there's roughly the same number of countries and comparable contributions of presentations to the UNGA every year. There's I would say on average 140 or
Pardon me,
150
ma'am.
countries.
I'm nobody in particular, so it's all the same to me. So you outsourced it to the UNGA rules of order so that they are the ones who have to create equality between the countries, and so you're able to kind of sample whatever the UN feels is the amount of contribution each country can give. Is
So
that a fair?
so every year,
Yeah.
every country is.
I think that's a great
given-
idea. I just wanted to make sure that I understood that.
Yeah.
And I'm
So
sorry to
every
put words in
year,
your mouth.
every country is given the opportunity to give a speech at the United Nations General Assembly General Debate, and it occurs in the same venue, in the same week, behind the same platform, and so it's as close to a controlled experiment for international language. We're not comparing apples to oranges here. A foreign policy speech from one leader on one particular day to a domestic policy speech from a different leader from a different day. It's the same venue, the same time constraints, the same set of circumstances.
Ma'am, I think it's just a great idea. I just want to know how you did it, and I think it's a genius idea. That's why I want to read the paper. It's just the outsourcing to the UN system, whatever they've come up with, because they had to fight this out for sure. Because each country is a country, and no matter how much, if you're a small island developing states, the SIDS, or you're a giant like the US, you're supposed to have the same kind of time. And so it's a genius idea. I just wanted to make sure, because I know you have to be mindful of your time here. And I feel that I'm taking the air out of you, and so I wanted to apologize. The last question I have for you was kind of like beautiful idea of having these very large macro trends. The question to you is, did you all consider in all those many different hypotheses how to disaggregate this so that you could control the kind of hypothesis testing in a way that you would know what people were talking about? Or since the concern was a strategic shift on whatever they were talking about, it never got to a point where you disaggregated on like specifics on, the keywords or some kind of keyword assisted type effect?
Sure. So we also ran a topic model over the entire period, the latent Dirichlet allocation, which there's lots of different ways to do this, but over time, we've settled on 50 topics, which all thematically hang together very nicely. So we can say, we can look at what countries are talking about substantively, not just the similarity between them stylistically and
there's stability on these 50 topics over 20 years?
No, I mean, some of them are, yes. I mean, there's some things that are fairly consistent over years, but there are other things that, for example, in another project, I'm looking at attention to climate change over time. And for many years, the way that the word climate was used was like a climate of cooperation or a climate of fear or a politically hostile climate, not at all semantically related to climate as in climate change.
Oh, of course. And just make sure I keep to the top. So you did an LDA, and the LDA was bottom up, right? You no keyword assisted, no guidance on the side, right? It was kind of a
So we removed
non-falsifiable hypothesis
common,
when it comes to the bar. Yeah.
We removed all common stop words and function words because we were most interested.
Corpus, yes.
Yes, but that was less of our focus for this paper. The content, it was how similarly, given that what countries can talk about whatever they want there, how similarly were countries matching, it's called linguistic style matching. How closely were they matching the United States in what they were saying?
I'm not sure if this is helpful to you. So at the Professor Imai at the government department has created this with the students something called Key ATM, keyword assisted something or other, where you're able to do the inverse of it, so you know exactly what keywords you want or dictionary you want, and then have the model do online learning on the data set, and you see the trends on how the different patterns work in that space. So you are able to invert the hypothesis, right? So that I don't know, I want to hear only about climate change, and then it will be able to say whether climate change is a stable LDA kind of thing, and give you a sense of that on the trends on who talks about this in some sense. And also it allows time embeddings, because my understanding is also that when you're trying to do LDA with time snapshots, you get all sorts of messy kind of math that is hard to deal with when it comes to time trends. At least that's my understanding. I never could get it to work. So I'm glad that you guys did, because this is amazing. Congratulations. So it's got missing the two time trends with the other things. It's a nightmare. So I'll just keep my mouth shut. I'm sorry to talk so much. And if it's okay, I'd love to follow up. I'm not sure how it works on these things because I've never interacted with any folks on your end. So, but it's a privilege to be able to annoy you for these 10 minutes here. I apologize. Thank you. Happy Friday.
Thank you. Thank you. And if you want to throw your email in the chat or anything like that, I'll write it down and I'll make sure you get our paper.
Yeah, and I'll on top of that, you can also for not just these Krulak Scholars and non-resident fellows, but to reach out to our broader network, just you can contact us at the Krulak Center directly, and we're happy to put you in touch with anyone who sort of aligns with your research interests. But definitely thank you for the questions here. And so I got a couple more in here that I want to get to before we hit the top of the hour, and then if I don't get any more, we'll go to closing comments, and hopefully some people can start their Fridays. But next question from MG LaMar, and that is asking, is there an early pattern of a country's speech that we can identify using linguistic methods that would alert agencies like Department of State and Department of Defense representatives to the need to focus on potential relationship problems that may be developing, before they get to the point where it turns into a rupture or a shift, or the point where basing access does become a challenge or a problem?
It's a fair question. We did not cover specific topic modeling within ours. We focused on meta trends as our metrics. So, and we did bring this up as an opportunity for future research, was topic modeling specific conversation pieces around, say, for example, if a free and open Pacific, as that keyword is used all the time, is consistently becoming a more common topic within a country, or something to the other end where we're sitting here saying we need to look out for ourselves, or we need to focus on our interests. America first becoming a common topic phrase, whether or not that should be what another country should sit there and say, is America first coming up a consistent number of times and increasing in trend actually going to translate to a change in cooperation? And unfortunately, we didn't cover that in this particular research, but it is certainly a topic goal that in future iterations we are interested in looking at.
Great, thanks. And then I had a question which I think is maybe sort of the obverse of what that one was, but so apologies if you retread some of the ground there, but I was curious if you and Dr. Windsor had looked at any of the language coming recently from European countries following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I realize that in terms of the breadth of the data set, it's relatively recent and probably small compared to the many years that you cover back in your other sets. But I was just curious. Like, we've certainly seen some actions that definitely indicate greater favorability to U.S. and other NATO allied troop deployments. But I was curious if any if you might see any language indicating any other sort of policy shifts or changes from the language that those leaders are using, that the ones that are not publicly saying, give me more NATO now, but maybe other keywords or indications that something in those lines might be coming.
I don't have anything specific, but Leah was actually studying this a little bit, so I'm not sure if she has anything to add to this conversation.
So last week, some colleagues and I had a meeting at the ISA conference informally, and their question was, to what extent can we comment based on language use about differences between the 2014 incident or conflict between Ukraine and Russia and now? And could this provide insight into Putin's state of mind, or sometimes people are written off as a madman, or foreign policy going off the rails. And what's interesting is that I've looked at some of the indicators of cognitive decline, and some of them start showing up for Putin around 2012, like decreased use of verbs and nouns, which is not at all to say that there's any, I'm not a medical doctor. I can't, diagnose that, but I saw similar trends, for example, with Margaret Thatcher. And, it wasn't revealed until after she had died that she had experienced, early onset dementia and cognitive decline alongside that. But it turns out her language showed that as well. And so this is still definitely in progress. We're looking at doing a informed blog post about this. But I haven't looked at other countries in the region recently since the onset of this particular incursion into Ukraine.
Okay, great, thank you. And on your point about the language and cognitive decline is very interesting. And in fact, this might actually tie into the next question here in the chat, which may be a tool to look at that. But so from James Coddington asking to hear more of your thinking from both of you on using machine learning techniques for this type of analysis. And I guess, did you use any type of machine learning or artificial intelligence assisted products as part of your research? And he's specifically asking about natural language processing as a machine learning tool.
Yes, so this is definitely natural language processing. We used a suite of tools, and I wanted to get back to this earlier. So we were limited in our analysis to only speeches given in English because there's a huge linguistic bias in the linguistic pipeline of software available for people to use. And so we know that things do get lost in translation. And so right now, if you want to look at the syntactic or the semantic properties of speeches across the world, the predominant software is available only in English. And so I have an NSF grant under review right now to help scale that up to the other 5 UN languages, which would allow us to do this same type of syntactic and semantic analysis in the target language. And I was a Minerva PI for many years between 2014 and 2019. And so, just being familiar with DoD funding priorities and the National Defense Strategy, it doesn't make a great pitch to say we need to develop a tool because people want basic research. The 6.1, we want to understand, fundamental questions about the world. But we also have to fund the tools that will get us there. So if we're just looking through the English language lens, we're going to miss things. So I think that we have a really good purchase on what's going on between U.S. allies and adversaries based on the content and the style similarity, but it would be so much more informative if we could analyze in the target languages. And so I just want to make my pitch again that we need to support funding these kind of basic, the tools that will help increase basic research in non-English languages, in endangered languages, and low resource languages. It would be very helpful if we could analyze speeches in Tagalog, right? I did a survey of directors of graduate studies across the US and about foreign language requirements. And almost all of them have no foreign language requirement. And if they do, it can be substituted with a statistics or a methods sequence. And so we increasingly have monolingual people studying things about the world, and we need to get more into primary source texts. But it's a hard sell because, funding a product is not ideal, but it's essential to get us to understand these important phenomena from within the original language.
Yeah. Just strongly agree with all of that. And I know that DoD has made some modest tools and attempts, but there's certainly no sort of larger overarching program trying to do that.
And I do understand that. I mean, I'm sure that there are plenty of people that say, oh, just do this and, integrate this into your workflow, and it will revolutionize everything. And that's not what I'm saying here either. I just think that it's important to have this type of purchase into understanding things in the original language. I think that there's an insularity within academia as well as within other, especially within the intelligence community, probably within the DoD as well, that everybody has their set of tools, and it's hard to uptake new ones. So.
Yeah, great. Actually, I got a question here from our Deputy Director, Lieutenant Colonel Manny Zepeda, that sort of jumps off on this, asking, so if, how would you propose to analyze language in the context, if you, I guess if you had, more tools, more options to do it, what's the best and proper way to go after it?
So I think the first thing would be to establish the reliability and the generalizability. So in a 2019 paper in +1, we looked at human translated, expert human translation and computer translated parallel aligned corpora, where the same sentence was expertly translated across the 6 UN languages, and then ran that through a bag of words dictionary-based program called Luke, and we looked at the stability across translations, and we found that overall there was pretty good reliability, that machine translation it's improved so much, in the last decade or so. It's on par with human translation, but that doesn't get at the syntactic properties. That's just looking at categories of words like pronouns or conjunctions or positive valenced words. So the first thing to do would be to analyze as much data as possible, starting probably with the UN corpus in each of these 6 different languages, and then comparing the stability of these measures across the languages to see, because languages differ in their properties. Some are subject, verb, object, some are subject, object, verb. And so there's going to be different ways that may not align one-to-one across languages. So it'd just be to get a sense of what are comparable measures across languages.
Great, thank you. So I got actually one more question I'm going to direct to Capt LaMar here, and then if I don't get anything else in the chat, we'll wrap it up. So Capt LaMar, this your research and your data sets here, they're obviously very macro and long term, looking at trends over of countries over the course of years or decades. But I'm curious, as you're in your new role here now in the 13th MU, do you have an eye to maybe some sort of applicability to your MU's operational requirements or challenges, or the environment that you're possibly going to deploy in, based on this research that you and Dr. Windsor have done?
Yeah, so we didn't cover it in this particular section, but we did run every single U.S. security partner in the Indo-PACOM theater. We did Thailand, we did Indonesia, we did Malaysia, we did everybody. And what I consistently found was that there's a lot of countries that are actually much more within what you would call the null hypothesis, or within this global macro trend, where they are consistently following what we were considering our control group. And so the question I kept on asking is, when we have these planned exercises with these countries, and when we have all these what we call operations and investments and activities, what are we attempting to achieve here? And often what we get into heated debates about at my level is, are we, through these exercises and through our presence in these countries, creating a positive environment for future cooperation? And I consistently saw in our research that that is not true, at least from a language perspective. And if we are saying that language is a true leading indicator of policy priorities, especially pattern similarity, the correlation to an increase in cooperation along exercises or an increase in U.S. troop presences in the form of port visits or in the form of these operation activities and investments that we talk about, I couldn't find the justification often that would be just assumed at the tactical level. Because often what we assume at the tactical level is that I'm doing something that feels like I am making a difference. I feel like the people I'm talking to on a daily basis have a more positive interpretation of the United States and security priorities than they did last week. And Allen et al. Kind of reinforces that, where they sit there and say, people who interact with the United States have positive opinions about the United States. And so what I get concerned about is at the tactical level, we might be experiencing success, but that isn't translating to operational level effects or what you would call campaigning. Because if we're not changing the policy priorities of these countries through these interactions, then a significant component of what we are attempting to achieve feels true at the tactical level, but doesn't translate to the strategic level. And I mean, this is only one research paper, and this is only one research topic. I can't stand on this beyond what it tells us for the here and now. But it gives me a lot of skepticism about what we just take for granted at the tactical level.
I think you may have just described the overarching challenge of the last 20 years for the U.S. military in terms of policy objectives it's trying to achieve at the tactical level and national objectives given to it. Yeah, definitely not something that one paper is going to solve and figure out. Although, you know, I'm not signing you up for future homework, but it might be interesting to, if there was a way to sort of either capture or go back and look at other recorded tactical level language and compare it with you know, that national level language coming out from leaders, and like where's the delta, and how does that happen between, you know, genuinely good positive tactical impacts and that language and that messaging not getting to the top. But story for another day, perhaps, or a future paper or conference. Great. So yeah, we're about 70 minutes now, and I don't have any other questions in the chat here. So I'll have to turn it over to yourself and Dr. Windsor for any final comments.
I have one very small thing now that we're closing up. Is it okay if I ask really quickly one thing?
Yeah, if we can keep it brief so we can get folks out here. But yeah, go ahead.
So in my world, one thing that always in the back of my mind is kind of like global knowledge, public goods in some sense, the global data sets that can be used by various researchers, whoever they happen to be on the international community or different places. I was wondering if there was ever an impetus of creating, I don't know, a comprehensive data set of all, I don't know, violations of freedom of navigation in the world, so that could become an outcome. Because I think that, in my humble opinion, I don't speak for the bank or anything like that, one of the biggest kind of public goods that has been provided by the U.S. as a platform is the wondrous of being able to move country-sized things around the world, and it almost works 99% of the time. It's amazing. But I don't think it's clear for the researchers, like, what does a violation look like, where it is, how it is, and so forth. And it's very hard to even understand that. And I think it's a miracle that the thing works so well as it does. And I'm not sure if that's something like the violations are something that's super like bad or something, but hopefully these are public violations and just can be monitored and classified. Just don't have the technical know-how to even know what they are or what they look like. Sorry to bother you. I'd love to, any global knowledge, public goods, anything like that. Sorry to, yeah.
No, I really appreciate the question. I don't know about a data set, but yeah, specific operational and tactical level data sets associated with maritime law and associated with how we do maritime competition. I am not familiar with any. I don't think I've seen. I don't know if Dr. Windsor's tracking any either.
So Sarah Mitchell at the University of Iowa does a lot on maritime law, and Paul Hensel at the University of North Texas at Denton works with her also on maritime law. There was a another Minerva-funded project that they were a part of, as well as Krista Wiegand and Brandon Prinz at University of Tennessee, Knoxville, that looked at scaling up the correlates of war data set to maritime issues. This is including things like disputes over fisheries and shared waters and boundaries. So I'll drop Sarah's.
Yeah, and I'd note as well for any other names or reference materials or articles, et cetera, that you would like to be shared along with this presentation when I post it, just feel free to go ahead and send it to me, and I'll include links to documents or other web pages or other researchers, et cetera, in the show notes when it goes out, so that everyone who was here and then everyone who couldn't make it can go ahead and get access to that stuff. Okay, great. So with that, any final closing comments or thoughts from either of you?
No, nothing for me. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Same. Thank you. And thank you, Capt LaMar. Fantastic work.
Thank you. Thank you. Seriously.
All right. Yeah, great. And thank you to both of you for taking the time. I know we did a pretty long lead time to get this set up, but I appreciate you both sticking with it and making this happen, because I think this will be a very valuable asset, certainly to our current crop of Krulak Scholars, but also to, as we can see in just the variety of audience members here, to a much broader community of interest. So thank you everyone in the audience as well for joining us for this week's Brewcast. Thank you for your questions. Next week, the Brewcast, we're going to be shifting back to the focus we've had the last couple of months on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where we'll be joined by Dr. Lasha Chanzuridze from Norwich University, and he's going to be looking at an overview and analysis of Russia's nuclear options in the context of its broader objectives in Ukraine. And as well, I'll just remind that our mini-series with Dr. Yuval Weber, our Russia subject matter expert, down the rabbit hole on the Russia-Ukraine war, we'll be continuing those out as well over the coming weeks. And in fact, we should have another one coming out today or tomorrow. So everyone keep an eye out for that as well on our social media and email channels. Otherwise, thank you both again. Thanks to the audience, and everyone have a good weekend.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.